The morning Caroline Doyle walked into Redemption Creek with nothing but 3 sleeping children, a cracked leather satchel, and a heart worn thin as old boot leather. The sky above the Texas panhandle was the color of a bruise healing slow. It was the autumn of 1882, and Redemption Creek sat at the edge of nowhere, wedged between the flat open grasslands and a crooked line of cottonwood trees that followed the creek bed south toward the Canadian River. The town had earned its name from the old preacher who'd staked the first claim there, a man who believed God had led him to that particular patch of dust and scrub for a reason. By 1882, the reason seemed mostly to be cattle, commerce, and the occasional fistfight outside the Silver Spur Saloon. But the church still stood on the north end of Main Street, white-painted and proud, with a bell tower that caught the afternoon light and threw it back like a signal fire. Caroline had walked nearly 3 miles that morning, coming from the turnoff where the stage had left her. She had not planned to be left there. She had planned to continue all the way to Amarillo, where her late husband's sister, a woman named Ruth, had promised in a letter that there might be something for her and the children. But the stagecoach driver had told her that her remaining ticket fare was not sufficient, and the argument that had followed had been brief and humiliating, and she had stepped down onto the road with her satchel and her 3 children and watched the stage disappear into the dust. Her oldest was a boy named Thomas, who was 7 years old and already carrying himself like he believed he had to be the man of the family. He walked beside her without complaint, holding the hand of his sister Eliza, who was 5 and prone to asking questions that had no easy answers. The youngest was Henry, barely 3 years old, and Caroline carried him on her hip for most of those 3 miles, switching him from side to side when her arms gave out. She had not eaten since the previous evening. The children had shared a biscuit and a piece of dried salt pork that morning at the roadside, but she had eaten none of it, telling them she was not hungry when in fact she had simply decided their need was greater than hers. When the white church tower appeared through the cottonwoods, something in her chest loosened just slightly. Not hope exactly, but something in the same family as hope. A kind of recognition that civilization was near, and with civilization came the possibility, however small, of kindness. The town was beginning to stir when she reached Main Street. A man loading barrels outside the general store paused to look at her. A woman sweeping a front porch straightened and watched her pass. Caroline kept her eyes forward. She had learned in the month since Robert had died that the worst thing you could do when you were desperate was to look desperate. You had to walk as though you were going somewhere. You had to look like you had a plan. She did not have a plan. She pushed open the door of the church because it was the only door she could bring herself to push open. Saloons were not for women with children. The hotel would want money. The general store would want something in return. But churches, in her experience, were at least theoretically built on the principle of welcome. The inside of the Redemption Creek community church smelled of candle wax and pine resin, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers someone had placed in a mason jar on the altar table. The pews were rough-hewn oak, worn smooth from years of Sunday sitting. The morning light came through 2 plain windows on the east wall and fell in long golden rectangles across the floor. Caroline sat down in the 3rd pew from the front. Henry was already half asleep against her shoulder. Eliza crawled up beside her and leaned against her arm. Thomas sat on her other side, very straight, looking at the cross above the altar with the expression of a boy trying hard to understand something he could not quite reach. "Are we sleeping here, Mama?" Eliza asked in a small voice. "Just resting," Caroline said, and she kissed the top of her daughter's head and pulled her closer. She had not meant to fall asleep. She had meant only to close her eyes for a few minutes, to let herself breathe, to think about what to do next. But the walking and the worry and the long days of uncertainty had worn her down to the bone, and the quiet of the church was the first true quiet she had known in weeks, and her body made the decision before her mind could argue with it. She slept. The children, one by one, found their own small positions of comfort. Henry curled against her lap. Eliza tucked her feet up onto the pew. Thomas, fighting it the longest, finally let his head drop against his mother's shoulder and was gone too. They slept through the early morning while the town of Redemption Creek went about its business outside, while horses were watered and bread was baked, and the blacksmith's hammer rang against iron in steady rhythm, and while the darkness at the edges of the sky turned from purple to gold to the pale clear blue of a Texas October morning. Ira Hunter had been in Redemption Creek for 6 weeks. He had come from San Antonio on the trail of a land dispute that had turned into something more complicated, and then the complications had resolved themselves in a way that left him temporarily without a clear next destination. He was a man of 32 years, lean and weathered in the way of men who spend most of their time outdoors, with dark eyes that had a habit of taking in more than their owner, let on, and hands that were equally comfortable with a rope, a hammer, or a deck of cards. He was not precisely a cowboy in the traditional sense, though he had driven cattle in his younger years and still wore the clothes of that life out of habit and familiarity. He was more accurately a man who had done many things and settled into none of them, which was not uncommon in 1882 Texas if you were honest about it. He boarded at the widow Hutchins's house on the south end of town, and he had been taking his Sunday breakfast there every week since arriving. But this Sunday he had woken before the widow's household stirred, and he had walked down to the creek in the early morning to think, which was something he did when the thinking required space. He had come back to town along Main Street and had seen the church door standing slightly ajar. He was not a particularly religious man, but he had been raised in a household where Sunday worship was not optional, and something about the open door pulled at an old muscle memory. He pushed it open and stepped inside. He saw them immediately. A woman on the third pew from the front, her dark hair fallen loose from whatever arrangement she'd set it in, her head tilted back slightly with sleep. 3 children arranged around her like something out of a painting, all of them breathing in that deep, boneless way that children sleep. The smallest boy was half in her lap. The little girl was pressed against her side with both hands tucked under her cheek. The older boy had his head against his mother's shoulder, and the woman herself. Even in sleep, even with the exhaustion written clear across her face, she was arresting. There was a quality to her features that he could not immediately name, something in the strong line of her jaw and the curve of her mouth that suggested both stubbornness and a capacity for warmth in equal measure. She wore a dress that had once been good quality but had seen hard weeks, and her boots were dusty from long walking. Ira stood very still in the doorway for a long moment. Then he stepped back out quietly, walked to the livery where old Mac kept a stack of horse blankets, and talked Mac into lending him 3 of the cleanest ones, which cost him 2 bits and a promise to return them by Monday. He walked back to the church, stepped inside as quietly as a man his size could manage, and spread 1 blanket over Caroline first, tucking it gently around her shoulders and Henry both. He draped the second carefully over Eliza, who stirred slightly but did not wake. He folded the third and arranged it around Thomas's shoulders, the boy sighing and shifting but staying under. Then he sat down in the very last pew at the back of the church, near the door, so he would be there when they woke up and the morning service crowd began to arrive. He did not know exactly why he did that. Something in him simply refused to leave them uncovered and unaware of what was coming. Reverend Aldous Marsh arrived at 7:30, which was his habit, to prepare the altar for the 9 o'clock service. He was a round-faced, pleasantly rumpled man of 55 who had seen enough of Texas to believe that God's work was mostly carried out in very small and ordinary moments. He stopped when he saw Ira sitting in the back pew. "Hunter," he said, surprised but not displeased. Ira tipped his head toward the front. Marsh looked and was quiet for a long moment. "She come in during the night?" he asked softly. "Before dawn, I think. She was here when I arrived. They were uncovered. I got blankets from Max." Marsh nodded slowly. "You know who she is?" "No, sir." Marsh did not know either. He stood a moment longer looking at the small, sleeping family, And then he went to his study and brought back the extra coat he kept there and draped it over the back of the pew nearest them, and he went about his preparations as quietly as he could manage. Caroline woke to the sound of boots on wooden floor and the soft murmur of voices. She came awake with that particular sharpness of a person who has slept in an unfamiliar place and whose first instinct is to account for her children. Henry was warm and breathing against her lap. Eliza was still beside her. Thomas was already awake, sitting up very straight, looking toward the back of the church with wide eyes. There was a blanket around her shoulders. She looked at it with a confusion that slowly shifted to something she could not quite name. It was a horse blanket, clean and thick and smelling of hay. She pulled it slightly tighter around herself and Henry and looked around. The church was filling. People were coming through the door in ones and twos, Sunday dressed, speaking quietly to one another. Several of them glanced at her. Some looked away. Some held her gaze with expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity to a kind of cautious sympathy. A man was sitting in the back pew watching her with dark eyes that were not unkind. He was tall, even seated, with the lean build of someone who had worked hard outdoors most of his life. He wore a dark coat over a collarless shirt, and his hat was in his hands. When he saw her looking at him, he did not look away. He gave a small nod, something between a greeting and an acknowledgement, and his expression was steady and quiet, nothing in it that made her feel she needed to be ashamed of where she was or what she looked like. She sat up straighter, pulled a hand through her hair, looked down at the blanket and then back at him. He rose from his pew and walked toward her with a measured, unhurried step and stopped at a respectful distance. "I hope the blankets were welcome," he said, quietly enough that it did not carry far. "You were all sleeping when I arrived. I didn't want to wake you, but it gets cold in here before the sun comes up." She looked at him. "You put these here?" "Yes, ma'am. Borrowed them from the livery. Mac's reasonable about such things." She felt something move in her throat that she had to push down. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with more weight than the two words could comfortably carry. "Ira Hunter," he said, and offered his hand. She took it. His grip was firm and brief and careful. "Caroline Doyle." "You come far, Mrs. Doyle." The missus told her that he had noticed or assumed. The ring was still on her finger. She supposed she had not decided yet what to do about that. "Far enough," she said. "The stage left me at the turnoff. Fair dispute." Something flickered in his eyes. "That's a 3-mile walk." "Yes, it is," she said simply. Eliza had woken and was examining the blanket around her with great interest. Henry stirred, lifted his head, and looked at Ira with the uncomplicated scrutiny of a 3-year-old. Thomas was still watching with that careful, measuring look. "I'm Eliza," Eliza announced to Ira, because Eliza had never met a stranger in her short life. "Hello, Eliza," Ira said, and his voice changed slightly when he spoke to her, something softening at the edges of it. "Did you sleep all right?" "I slept very well," Eliza said seriously. "The blanket is scratchy, but it's warm." "That's usually the bargain," he said. The Reverend appeared at his elbow, and Caroline stood automatically, Henry on her hip, the blanket falling aside. The Reverend had a kind face, and he took both her hands in his and told her she was welcome, and that she should stay for the service, and that after the service there would be coffee and biscuits in the fellowship hall, and she was to have some. It was the first genuinely unconditional welcome she had received from a stranger in longer than she could remember, and she had to look at the ceiling for a moment to keep herself composed. The service was a simple one. Reverend Marsh preached about the particular grace of sheltering those who needed it, which Caroline was not sure was a coincidence, and Henry fell asleep again in her lap within the first 10 minutes, and Eliza drew small pictures with her finger on the wooden pew, and Thomas sat with the focused attention of a boy trying to understand what God had to do with his present circumstances. Ira sat 2 pews behind her and to the left. She could feel that he was there in the way you feel when someone's attention is placed on you with a certain kind of care, not intrusive, just present. After the service, in the fellowship hall, there were biscuits and coffee and several women who came to introduce themselves with the frank, practical kindness of small-town women who had seen hard situations before and knew what was actually helpful. A woman named Martha Greer brought extra biscuits for the children without being asked. A woman named Clara Watts asked Caroline quietly whether she had family in the area and what her situation was. Caroline told the truth, because she had found that lying required energy she no longer had. Her husband, Robert Doyle, had died of pneumonia the previous March in Lubbock. He had been a carpenter by trade and a good man, and he had left her with 3 children, a small amount of debt, and a house that the bank had eventually taken. She had been making her way toward Amarillo and her sister-in-law's offer of help, which had been neither confirmed nor definitive, and the stage had left her here. Clara Watts listened to all of this with a level, thoughtful expression. "My husband runs the general store," she said when Caroline was done. "He could use a hand keeping the books. Can you figure?" Caroline blinked. "I can. I kept our household accounts for 8 years." "Well then," Clara said, with the efficiency of a woman who had identified a problem and a solution in the same breath, "I'll speak to Harold." Ira was at the edge of the room, holding a tin cup of coffee and speaking with the blacksmith about some matter or another, but his eyes came to Caroline periodically in a way that was not obvious but that she began to notice nonetheless. Not staring, just checking. The way a person looks at something they have decided, quietly and without announcement, to pay attention to. She ate 2 biscuits and drank coffee and watched her children eat with the desperate focus of children who had not had enough for several days, and she felt the terrible tight wound spring in her chest loosen another increment. After the fellowship hall had mostly cleared, she found herself outside in the thin October sunshine, standing with Henry on her hip and Thomas and Eliza running along the churchyard fence. Ira came to stand beside her with his hat back on his head, and for a moment they both just looked at the children without speaking. "Doyle," he said after a while, "was your husband Robert Doyle who did the framing work on the Lubbock courthouse extension?" She looked at him. "You knew him, knew of him. I was in Lubbock the spring before last. Someone pointed out his work. They said he was good." "He was very good," she said, and the words came out with a quiet steadiness that she was proud of because she had not been able to say his name without crying for months, and something about the simple acknowledgement of his skill made it easier. "I'm sorry for your loss," Ira said. He said it the way a man says something when he actually means it rather than when he says it because it is expected. "Thank you," she said. They stood in silence again, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that had room in it. "Mrs. Doyle," he said finally, "I won't pretend I know your situation fully, but I know this town reasonably well after 6 weeks of boarding here, and there are decent people in it. Clara Watts is as good as her word. If she said she'd speak to Harold, she will, and Harold Watts is a fair man." "You're being very kind," she said. "You didn't have to do any of this, the blankets, the introduction." "I haven't introduced you to anyone," he said. "You've introduced yourself." She looked at him. There was something in his expression that was neither smug nor performatively modest, just honest and a little wry, and she found it unexpectedly disarming. "Well," she said, "thank you for the blankets, then." "Mac'll want them back Monday," he said. "I'll see to that," she laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, coming up from somewhere she had forgotten was still there. It was small and quick, but it was real, and she saw something in his eyes shift very slightly when he heard it, something that opened and then carefully arranged itself back to neutral. The Watts family did not have a spare room, but Clara organized, with the efficient mobilization of a woman who had done such things before, the use of the small back room at the church for the short term. It was plain but clean, with a wood stove and 2 narrow cots and a folding table, and Reverend Marsh said they were welcome to it for as long as they needed, speaking as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. Caroline settled her children that evening with a thoroughness and gratitude that made something ache behind her ribs. Thomas helped her with Henry's boots without being asked. Eliza fell asleep with her hand around Caroline's finger. She sat in the dark after they were all sleeping and looked at the ceiling and thought about all the decisions that had brought her here and all the decisions that still lay ahead, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, something she could barely identify. Not happiness, not security, but the faint, tentative beginning of the idea that those things might be possible again, that the road was not necessarily finished. She thought about the blankets. She thought about the way Ira Hunter's eyes had moved from her children back to her with something steady in them, something that did not demand anything or calculate anything, just looked. She told herself firmly that she was not in any position to be thinking about a man she had met that morning, and she went to sleep. Harold Watts turned out to be precisely as Clara had represented him, a deliberate, square-faced man of 50 who had built his business on the principle that honesty and accuracy were more valuable than charm and speed. He interviewed Caroline at the counter of the general store on Monday morning, asked her 4 specific questions about accounting methods, listened to her answers, and offered her a fair wage for 3 days a week, with the option to expand if she proved reliable. She told him she would prove reliable. She began that afternoon, sitting at the desk in the back office with the ledger book spread before her, while Thomas was put to useful work helping to stack the new delivery of dry goods with a seriousness that made Harold nod approvingly. Eliza and Henry were kept in the back with a set of old jar lids that Eliza immediately organized into a complex game the rules of which only she understood. Ira came into the store that afternoon for fence wire and cornmeal, which he needed for some work he was doing out at the Becker Ranch, where he had taken on a short-term job mending fences on the south pasture. He saw Thomas stacking tins with focused care and stopped to look at the boy. "You do good work," he said. Thomas looked up. The boy had his mother's jaw. Ira noticed the same quality of stubborn steadiness. "Mr. Watts showed me where things go," Thomas said. "It's important to put them back where they belong." "That's right," Ira said. Harold Watts came up behind him and said, in his dry way, that the new bookkeeper he had started that afternoon was already 3 months ahead in the reconciliation, and had found a billing error in the September accounts that had been giving him a persistent headache. He said this to Ira in the way that people in small towns convey information they think is relevant to the listener's interest, and then he went back to his work with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who has solved a problem. Ira bought his fence wire and cornmeal and left. He thought about her during the ride out to the Becker place. The open flat land under the October sky was the particular golden brown of the Texas panhandle at that time of year, and the wind came off the grass in steady, cool sweeps that smelled of dry earth and distant rain. He thought about the way she had stood in the churchyard with Henry on her hip, straight-backed and clear-eyed, and the way she had laughed at his remark about Mac and the blankets, that brief, surprised laugh that had the quality of something long kept in reserve, suddenly stepping out into light. He had not been thinking about finding a woman to attach his life to. He had, in fact, been specifically not thinking about it for the better part of 3 years, since an engagement in San Antonio had ended badly for reasons that were complicated and mostly his fault, and that he had spent considerable time reckoning with since. He had decided, in the practical and somewhat stubborn way of a man who has made one large error in judgment, that he was better suited to solitude than to the entanglements of domestic life. He was beginning to suspect, riding out through the golden grass toward the Becker fence line, that this opinion required revision. He returned to Max the following morning and settled the business of the blankets, and then, because he was passing the church anyway, he stopped in at the back room to return them himself rather than leaving them at the livery. Caroline answered his knock with flour on her hands, which told him she had gotten access to someone's stove for baking, and the children were visible behind her in a domestic tableau of remarkable normalcy given where they had been 48 hours earlier. "Blankets," he said, and held them out. She took them, looking faintly amused. "You didn't have to bring them yourself." "Max is just up the street," he said, which was not entirely true. She stepped back from the door in an implicit invitation. He stepped inside. The small room had been transformed in 2 days in the way that women transform spaces when they are determined to make something habitable. There was a cloth over the folding table and a small arrangement of dried grasses in a cup, and the children's few possessions arranged with a care that made the space feel cared for rather than temporary. "Have you eaten?" she asked. "I was about to head to the boarding house." "I made biscuits," she said. "There are more than the children will eat." He sat down at the table in the chair she indicated and ate biscuits with dried apple preserves that Clara Watts had apparently brought over the previous evening, and Caroline sat across from him with her coffee and they talked. He asked about her. She told him things selectively, but honestly, the way a person does when they are beginning to determine how much trust is warranted. She told him about Robert, about the years of building something in Lubbock, about the way pneumonia had come on fast in March and been gone, taking Robert with it in 2 weeks. She told him about the months of trying to hold it together, the debt that had accumulated without either of them knowing quite how bad it was, the bank's patience that had run out in August. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and without the particular quality of calculated sympathy that she had encountered from some people in her situation, men and women both, who listened with one eye on what the information meant for them. He told her when she asked that he had grown up in the hill country outside of Austin, youngest of 4 boys. Father was a rancher, that he had driven cattle up the Kishom Trail twice in his early 20s, and then moved into various kinds of land and ranch work after that, that he had been in San Antonio most recently, and before that in the Pecos Valley, and before that a dozen other places. "You haven't stayed anywhere long," she observed, not as an accusation, just an observation. "No," he agreed. "Why not?" He thought about it. "Nothing held me." She looked at him for a moment and then at her coffee cup. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Caroline worked at Watts's store 3 days a week, and the other days she managed the small room and the children and began to look for more permanent lodging because the church room was a gift but not a solution. She and the Reverend's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Bess Marsh, developed a friendship based on mutual respect and the practical exchange of information, which was the standard form of female friendship in Redemption Creek. Ira came and went from the Becker Ranch, coming back into town on Wednesdays and Fridays. He had a habit of stopping at the general store on those days for one thing or another, and the timing of those stops happened to coincide with Caroline's working hours, which Harold Watts noted with the quiet amusement of a man who notices everything but says little. She noticed too. She would have been a fool not to. But she was a widow with 3 small children and a very recently assembled life, and she kept herself sensible about it, keeping the conversation practical and pleasant, and not reading anything into the fact that his eyes, when he thought she was not looking, held something that was considerably warmer than practical and pleasant. One Wednesday in late October, he arrived at the store as she was locking the back office, and she was wearing a different dress than usual, one that Clara Watts had pressed on her from a box of things she had no use for, a dark blue wool that fit Caroline better than it had ever fit Clara, and that did things for her coloring that the old worn dress had not been able to do. Ira walked into the store and stopped walking with a completeness that was almost comical, just for a second, before he recovered himself and asked Harold if the fence wire shipment had come in. Harold said it had, and showed him to the back without looking at Caroline, which was its own kind of commentary. She found herself smiling at the storeroom wall where no one could see her. On a Thursday in early November, she found a set of 2 rooms above the saddle maker's shop on the south end of Main Street that she could afford with her wages, and a small arrangement she had made with Harold about additional bookkeeping hours. It was not spacious, but it was above the ground and had a real stove and a window in each room, and she felt something close to fierce triumph when she signed the rental agreement with the saddle maker, a laconic man named Joe Prater, who seemed pleased to have the upstairs occupied. She told Ira about it when she saw him that Friday. 2 rooms above Prater's, she said. Stove. The children have the front room and I have the back. Prater keeps a clean building, he said. You'll be warm in there. I need to get a few more things settled, she said, but it feels like standing on ground instead of on water, which is an improvement. He was leaning on the counter with his hat in his hand, watching her with that steady attention, and he said, "You have done more in 3 weeks than most people do in 3 months." She met his eyes. "I have 3 people depending on me." "I know," he said quietly. "I know you do." There was a pause, the kind with weight in it, and then Thomas appeared from behind a shelf of dry goods with an inquiry about whether Ira knew anything about horses, because he had been thinking about horses lately. Ira turned to Thomas with the same unhurried attention he gave everything and asked him what specifically he had been thinking. And Thomas, who was generally cautious with strangers, began to talk with an unguarded enthusiasm that Caroline had not seen from him in months, possibly not since before Robert died. She watched them from behind the counter, the lean, dark-eyed man crouching to Thomas's level with genuine interest, and the boy who had been carrying too much weight for his 7 years finally putting some of it down. And she felt something shift inside her that was larger and more complicated than she was ready to name. They moved into the rooms above Prater's on a Saturday in mid-November, and Ira appeared at 8 in the morning with a buckboard he had borrowed from the Beckers, because the few things Caroline had accumulated needed moving, and she had been going to carry them in 2 trips. "You didn't need to do this," she said, which was becoming something of a refrain between them. "2 trips is unnecessary," he said, which was becoming something of a refrain on his side. He helped her move the cots and the folding table and the collection of things the women of Redemption Creek had quietly assembled for her. A quilt from Bess Marsh, a set of mismatched dishes from Clara Watts, a small lamp from the Reverend, a rocking chair from a woman named Dolores Gutierrez who lived on the Mexican side of town, and who had pressed Caroline's hands warmly when she brought it, and said in Spanish and halting English that a mother needed somewhere to sit. When everything was arranged upstairs and the children were exploring their rooms with the intense proprietary interest of children who have been without a fixed space for too long, Ira stood in the small kitchen area and looked around at what they had assembled. "It looks like a home," he said. "It will be one," she said, with a certainty she was only then discovering she had. He looked at her with that expression she was coming to know, the one that was warm and careful and held something it was not yet saying, and then he picked up his hat from the table. "I'll return the buckboard," he said. "Ira," she said. He stopped. "Stay for dinner. I can make something from the stores Harold gave me yesterday." The pause between the invitation and his answer was not long, but it was complete, and in it she felt the significance of what she had said and was not sorry she had said it. "All right," he said. "Thank you." They ate rabbit stew that she made from the dried rabbit and root vegetables in her stores, and it was better than the circumstances warranted. And Thomas asked Ira 14 questions about horses and received 14 patient answers. And Eliza fell asleep in her chair before the meal was finished and had to be carried to bed. And Henry ate with both hands and then fell asleep in his stew bowl nearly. And Caroline cleaned him up and put him down with the efficiency of a woman who has done this 10,000 times. When she came back to the small table, Ira was washing the bowls in the basin, which she had not asked him to do, and she stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment, this careful, quiet man in her small kitchen, and felt something move through her that was warm and alarming in equal measure. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, rinsing a bowl. She came and took the towel from the hook and dried what he washed, and they stood side by side at the basin in the lamplight, and she could feel the warmth of him through the small space of air between them, and her hands were steady but her heartbeat was not. "Ira," she said, Yes. I want to say something and I am not entirely sure how to say it. He set down the bowl he was holding and turned to look at her, and there was nothing in his expression except complete and quiet attention. You have been very good to us, she said carefully. From the beginning, the blankets and then everything after. And I notice it, and my children notice it, and I don't want to make it into something it isn't, so I am going to ask you plainly what it is. He was quiet for a moment that felt long. I would like it to be something, he said. If that is a welcome thing to say. She looked at him for a long moment. I have 3 children and a very new situation, and I am not ready for anything rushed. I am not a rushed man, he said. Ask anyone in Redemption Creek who has watched me eat lunch. She laughed, that same surprised, released laugh, and it did the same thing to him it had done the first time, something opening behind his ribs that he had been keeping carefully sealed. Then I think we understand each other, she said. I think we do, he agreed, and turned back to the basin with a composure that was not entirely convincing, and she turned back to the drying, and they finished the dishes in a silence that was full to the edges with everything that had just been admitted. November deepened into a cold and brilliant thing, the sky over the panhandle turning a particular sharp blue that cut like something beautiful and painful both. The cottonwoods along the creek went from gold to bare, and the wind came harder, and Redemption Creek settled into the particular interior season of a small western town, people moving between warm spaces quickly, gathering more often around stoves and in shared halls. Ira finished the fence work at the Becker Ranch in the second week of November, and then settled into a period of various employed usefulness around Redemption Creek. He helped the blacksmith for 2 weeks when the man's assistant fell ill. He did carpentry work for Harold Watts on the expansion of the store's back room. He was good with his hands and his word, and the town, which had been watching him with the cautious assessment that small towns apply to newcomers, began to relax around him in the manner of a community deciding that someone was worth keeping. He came to dinner above Prater's saddle shop twice a week, on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and it became a thing that the children counted on and that Caroline planned for. Thomas began to teach Ira about the card game he had invented, which had rules so elaborate and internally consistent that Ira spent an entire Saturday evening learning them, and declared it the best card game he had ever encountered, which made Thomas glow in a way that Caroline had to look away from to keep herself composed. Eliza adopted the habit of saving things to tell Ira specifically, small observations about the world that she deemed significant, and that could apparently wait until Wednesday or Saturday to be shared. She began one evening by announcing that she had found a stone that was perfectly round, and that she had decided it was the most valuable stone in Redemption Creek, and she pressed it into Ira's hand with great ceremony and told him it was his. He put it in his vest pocket and wore it every day after that, which Eliza verified by asking him about it on subsequent visits, and he always produced it, and she always examined it to ensure it was the original, and he always waited with patient gravity while she did. Henry, who was 3 and whose opinions were largely communicated through action rather than language, developed the habit of climbing onto Ira's lap during the after-dinner portion of the evening, positioning himself there with the straightforward confidence of a small person who has decided where they belong. Caroline watched all of this with a feeling that was growing too large for the careful, cautious container she was trying to keep it in. One Saturday evening in December, after the children were asleep, and they were sitting on opposite sides of the small table with the lamp burning between them and the stove ticking softly in the cold, Ira said, "Tell me about Robert." She looked up. He was watching her with the careful, open attention that was his particular quality, and there was nothing in his expression except genuine wanting to understand. She told him. She told him about meeting Robert at a church social in Austin when she was 20 and he was 22, and the 3 years of courtship, and the wedding, and the building of the life in Lubbock. She told him about the fights they had had, because she was being honest, and about the way they had always been able to talk through the hard things because they both believed in that. She told him about Robert singing to the children when they were small, off-key, and enthusiastic, and about the way he had held her hand every single time they sat in church, as though he was afraid she might float away. Ira listened to all of it. "He sounds like a man worth grieving," he said when she was done. "He was," she said. She looked at her hands. "I am still grieving him." "I know," he said. "That doesn't seem like a contradiction to me." She looked up. "Some people make it feel like one." "Some people are wrong," he said simply. She felt something in her chest expand and then hold very still, like a note held at the end of a piece of music before the silence. "Ira," she said. "What happened in San Antonio?" He was quiet for a moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, an opening and a reckoning both. He told her about Eleanor Marsh, no relation to the Reverend, a woman he had been engaged to for 8 months in 1879. He told her that he had not been present enough, had been too absorbed in work and in the habit of his own independence, had treated the engagement as a beginning rather than as something that required daily tending. He told her that Eleanor had ended it and that she had been right to do so, and that he had spent 3 years with a fairly clear-eyed understanding of what he had done wrong. "That's honest," Caroline said. "The least I can do with it is be honest," he said. She nodded. The lamp threw their shadows large and quiet on the walls. Outside, the December wind moved along Main Street, and somewhere below them Joe Prater's sign creaked on its chain. "I'm not the same man I was then," Ira said. "I don't say that to ask you to take it on faith. I say it because I think you deserve to know where I started from." "Where do you think you are now?" she asked. He looked at her across the lamp. "I think I am a man who has found something he did not know he was looking for," he said, "and who intends to deserve it." The silence after that was not empty. It was the opposite of empty. She did not say anything dramatic. She reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly, and then took it back. And they sat for another hour talking about smaller things, practical things, and the warmth between them was large enough by then that it did not need naming to fill the room. Christmas came to Redemption Creek with the particular brightness of a holiday observed in a place where celebration is seasonal relief from hard work and cold. The church decorated with cedar boughs and ribbons, and Clara Watts organized a small fair in the town hall with baked goods, and a fiddler named Pete Alvarez, who could make even the most dignified member of the congregation want to dance. Caroline had saved what she could from her wages, and she made the children small gifts. A wood horse for Henry, carved by Joe Prater, who had turned out to be surprisingly tender with children. A small journal for Eliza, who had demonstrated a strong desire to record things. A book on horses for Thomas, which had taken most of her savings, but which Thomas received with an expression of such pure joy that she knew she had chosen correctly. Ira arrived at the Christmas morning gathering at the town hall with a parcel wrapped in brown paper, and inside were 4 gifts. For Henry, a small carved horse of his own, more detailed than Joe's, which Ira had made himself during the long December evenings by the boarding house fire. For Eliza, a set of colored pencils that had come in on the general store's December shipment, and that he had asked Harold to set aside. For Thomas, a pair of real leather gloves sized for a boy's hand, with a note in Ira's plain handwriting that said they were for writing, when the time came. For Caroline, a small book of poems by Walt Whitman, which he handed to her separately from the others, quietly, with a look that was not elaborate but that said very directly what it meant. The inside cover read, in the same plain handwriting, "For a woman who deserves more beautiful things than this world has been giving her lately." She had to step outside briefly after reading it, into the cold December air, and stand alone for a minute with the book against her chest, and her eyes closed and the wind on her face. He found her there a few minutes later. He stood beside her and said nothing, and she leaned sideways until her shoulder was against his arm, and they stood that way in the cold outside the town hall while the fiddle played inside, and the children's voices rose and fell in waves of delighted noise. "Ira," she said. "Yes. I think I am ready to say the thing I have been not saying." He waited. "I love you," she said. She said it in a clear, steady voice, like a woman stating a fact she has verified carefully. "I didn't expect to. I wasn't looking for it. But you are the most careful, most present, most genuinely decent man I have met in a very long time. And my children trust you. And my children are very good judges of people. And I think I have been in love with you since approximately the Saturday in November when you sat on the floor and learned Thomas's entire card game system, without once looking as though you wished you were somewhere else." He was quiet for a moment that was not an absence of response but a full presence of it. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you looked at a borrowed horse blanket with the expression of a woman who had been given something worth more than gold, and thanked me in a voice that made me feel I had done something genuinely important for the first time in a long while." She turned to look at him. His face in the winter light was open and serious and warm, and she stepped forward and he met her halfway, and he kissed her there in the cold outside the Redemption Creek Town Hall, while inside Pete Alvarez played a reel and her children were alive and safe and fed. And it was December 1882. And she was 29 years old, and she had thought the best of her life was behind her, and she had been wrong. The town of Redemption Creek, in the manner of all small towns, had been watching and drawing conclusions for weeks. And so the news of the understanding between Caroline Doyle and Ira Hunter was received without great surprise, but with considerable satisfaction by most of its inhabitants. Clara Watts said she had known from the first Wednesday he had appeared at the store on what she described as very unconvincing fence wire errands. Harold Watts said nothing, but appeared quietly pleased. Reverend Marsh told Ira in a brief, man-to-man conversation that he had no theological objections and several personal approvals. Bess Marsh invited Caroline for tea and said the same things women say to each other when they are genuinely happy for one of their own. Ira's position in town had by now become something more than transient. He had been offered and accepted a part-time foreman arrangement with the Becker Ranch that would carry through the spring, and he had also taken on a lease arrangement on a small plot of land east of town that had been vacant for 2 years. The land had a structure on it that had once been a soddy and had since been partially upgraded with timber framing, and it had a well, and it had 12 acres of flat ground that could be worked. He told Caroline about the land on a January evening, sitting at her table with the children in bed and the stove burning, and he showed her the survey map, which he spread on the table between them. "I'm not asking anything of you," he said first clearly, so there was no misunderstanding. "This is something I am doing regardless, but I want you to know about it because I want you to know everything about what I am doing and what I am thinking." She looked at the map. 12 acres, a well, a structure that needed work. She looked at the marks he had made on the survey in pencil, notes about where fencing was needed and where the garden plot might go. "A garden plot," she said. "You'd need a kitchen garden," he said, "for the children." She looked at him across the map. "Ira Hunter," she said. "Yes. Are you courting me with a land survey?" He looked caught for just a moment. "I don't know that it's the most romantic approach," he admitted. "It is possibly the most accurate approach," she said. "Show me where the well is." He showed her. They spent the next hour with their heads bent together over the map, and she made suggestions and he wrote them in pencil, and the evening had the character of something being built rather than merely dreamed about, and that was exactly the kind of love she had learned to trust. February arrived with cold that went deeper than the bones and ice that formed on the insides of windows, and Ira hired 2 men from town to help him start the work on the structure east of Redemption Creek, expanding the timber framing and adding proper walls and a real foundation under what had been dirt floored. Caroline came out on Saturdays with the children, and Thomas became Ira's most earnest small helper, carrying lumber and fetching nails with a seriousness of purpose that made the hired men grin. On one such Saturday in mid-February, with the sky a pale, clear, cold blue and the grass white with frost at the edges, Ira took Caroline aside from the children and the noise of hammers and stood with her at the edge of the 12 acres, looking east where the land rolled out flat and wide toward the horizon. He did not have a ring. He told her this up front, directly, in the same way he said all important things. "I don't have a ring yet, but I want to ask you something, and I did not want to wait for a ring to ask it." She looked at him. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because you need someone and not because of the children, though I love your children and I would be honored to help you raise them, but because you are the most honest and brave and real person I have met in my entire life, and I want to spend the rest of it in the same house as you, watching you keep a set of books and make biscuits and win arguments, which you will, and I am extremely content with that prospect." She was very still for a moment, looking at him with the clear, steady gaze that he had come to believe could see through stone. "Thomas, Eliza, and Henry," she said, "you understand what marrying me means." "I do," he said. "I am asking all four of you." She took a breath of cold February air that felt like something clarifying, like the world coming into focus. "Yes," she said. "The answer from all four of us is yes." He did get a ring, 2 weeks later, from a jeweler in Amarillo who came through Redemption Creek on a trading circuit. It was a simple band with a small turquoise stone set in silver, and when he put it on her finger she looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "It suits you," he said. "It does," she agreed, and held his hand a while longer, her thumb over the ring, not letting go. They were married in the Redemption Creek Community Church on the 15th of March, 1883, exactly a year and 2 weeks after Robert Doyle had died of pneumonia in Lubbock. Caroline had thought about the timing and decided that Robert, who had been a practical man and a loving one, would have understood. She still wore his memory the way she wore the bones he had given her children, deeply and permanently, as part of the structure of who she was. But she was also alive, and her children needed a present life, and the man standing beside her at the altar was someone Robert's best instincts would have recognized and approved of. The church was full. Redemption Creek turned out thoroughly for the occasion. Clara Watts had organized food for the reception with characteristic efficiency. Dolores Gutierrez brought tamales that were consumed within the first 20 minutes. Pete Alvarez brought his fiddle. Harold Watts gave a short and unexpectedly moving toast in which he said that good people finding each other was the best argument for small towns he had ever encountered. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony with the warmth of a man who had watched these two people move toward each other for months and felt personally vindicated by their arrival at this moment. Thomas stood beside Ira during the ceremony, very straight, in the new shirt Caroline had sewn him, and gave Ira a nod of such solemn confirmation when the Reverend asked if anyone had objections that a ripple of quiet laughter moved through the congregation. Eliza wore a white ribbon in her hair and was almost completely focused on the ceremony, except for the 2 minutes she spent examining the pattern on the church floor. Henry wore his best clothes and fell asleep during the vows, leaning against Thomas, and no one thought this was anything other than perfect. When Ira kissed his bride, it was with the restraint appropriate to a church full of people, and with a warmth that communicated, to anyone paying close attention, everything that had been building since an October morning when he had walked into a church and found a woman and her children sleeping on a pew without enough covering. They moved into the house east of town in April, when it was finished enough to be habitable. There were still things to be done, trim work and a second room and the kitchen garden, but it was warm and solid and it was theirs. And the night they slept there for the first time as a family, Caroline stood in the main room after the children were in bed and turned slowly in the lamplight, seeing the shape of the life she was inside, and felt something so complete and whole that she was not sure there was a word for it. Ira came to stand behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and they were quiet together in their house with the sound of the Texas night outside and their children breathing in the next room. "Are you happy?" he asked, low and close to her ear. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He turned her gently to face him and looked at her in the lamplight with his dark eyes that had always held more than they showed, and now they were showing it. "I'm happier than I knew how to be before," he said, "which I think is the best kind." Spring on the panhandle had a quality of extraordinary abundance after the long cold, the grass coming green and the creek running high, and the sky so blue it seemed almost violent in its beauty. Caroline planted her kitchen garden with an intensity of purpose that amused Ira, who would come home from the Becker work, and find her on her knees in the newly turned earth with Henry beside her, the two of them dark with soil and deeply pleased with themselves. Thomas had his first riding lesson in April, on a gentle quarter horse that one of the Becker hands named Domingo lent them for the afternoon. Ira walked beside them for the whole lesson, one hand on the horse's neck, talking Thomas through it in the same patient, attentive way he did everything. Thomas sat that horse like he had been waiting for it his whole life, and by the end of the afternoon he was steering at a walk with a confidence that made Domingo shake his head and say that the boy had natural balance. Caroline watched from the fence with Eliza beside her and her hand in her apron pocket, and something large and quiet moving through her chest. Eliza, for her part, was filling her journal with observations that grew more elaborate every week. She showed Caroline entries about the way the creek looked in different lights, about the exact number of cottonwood trees she had counted between the house and town, about a conversation she had conducted with a roadrunner bird who she believed understood her. "Eliza," Caroline said one evening, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" Eliza considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old approaching a serious philosophical question. "Someone who writes things down," she said. "So people know what it was like." Caroline looked at her daughter for a long moment. "That's a beautiful thing to want to be," she said. In June, Caroline began to understand that something had changed in her body. She did not say anything to Ira for 2 weeks because she was not sure, and because she wanted to be certain before she opened that particular door. But by the end of June she was quite certain, and she told him on a Wednesday evening when the children were asleep, and the summer dark was warm and full of cricket sound, and the lamp was burning low. He was very still for a moment when she told him. Then his whole face changed in a way she had only seen once or twice before, on the very largest occasions, all the careful steadiness coming apart into something unguarded and full. He came around the table and took both her hands and held them, and he said, "Are you well? Is everything all right with you?" "I am very well," she said. "I am healthy and strong and very well." He exhaled something that was not quite a word and pressed his forehead down to hers, and they stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads together, his hands wrapped around hers, and outside the summer insects sang in the long grass, and inside the lamp burned and the house was quiet and full. The Redemption Creek summer was long and hot in the way of the panhandle, but it had its pleasures, cool evenings and cold water from the well, and the garden coming in with a generosity that astonished Caroline, who had not grown a kitchen garden before, and had not expected such an abundant repayment for effort. She and Ira fell into the daily life of a genuine partnership, which was different from what she had had with Robert, not lesser but different, built on different materials and in a different form. Robert had been her first love, her youth, the father of her children, and she carried him with gratitude and grief both. Ira was her present and her chosen future, built on the knowledge of loss and the deliberate decision to love again, which was its own particular kind of courage, and produced its own particular kind of richness. They fought occasionally, because they were both strong-minded people, and the fights were real, but they were also, invariably, resolved by the morning, because both of them had been marked by loss enough to know that unresolved fights were a form of arrogance about the future's availability. They talked about everything. He told her things he had not said to another person, about the years of wandering and the loneliness that had accumulated in them, about the specific regret of the San Antonio engagement, about the father he had lost to a horse accident when Ira was 21. She told him about the complicated grief of watching Robert suffer those 2 weeks in March, about the anger she had felt at God that she had been trying to make peace with ever since, about the fear she still sometimes woke with at 3 in the morning, the one that said this could be taken too. He said, when she told him about the 3 in the morning fear, "Tell me when it comes. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." And she did. She woke him once in August at some dark hour and said simply, "The fear," and he pulled her close and held her while it passed, not speaking, not fixing anything, just being present in the particular way that was more useful than any words. And when it was gone, she slept again with her head against his shoulder. And in the morning he got up and made breakfast without mentioning it because she did not need it mentioned, just remembered. In February of 1884, Caroline's labor began in the small hours of a cold night, and Bess Marsh, who had been on notice for weeks, arrived with the practical competence of a woman who had attended many such occasions. Ira was sent to the main room with Thomas and Eliza and Henry, all 4 of them arranged in varying degrees of anxiety, Thomas attempting to be calm for the smaller children and not quite managing it, Eliza asking questions and receiving reassurances, Henry asleep on Ira's lap with enviable equanimity. When Bess came out to tell him it was done, and that Caroline was well, and that he had a son, Ira sat completely still for a moment with his eyes closed, and his hand on Henry's sleeping back. And then he stood and carried Henry to his cot and went into the room where Caroline was, and there was a small boy in her arms wrapped in white cloth, very new and very real, and looking at the world with the vague, unfocused intensity of someone who has just arrived somewhere and is still taking it in. Caroline looked up at him with a tiredness that was also something bright. "Come and meet him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. The baby turned his head slightly toward the sound of the new voice, and Ira touched the side of his face with one careful finger. "Hello," he said very softly. "I have been waiting for you." They named him William Robert Hunter, the Robert deliberate and clear and agreed upon between them without long discussion, because it was right. William Robert would grow up knowing who had come before him and what that meant. Thomas came in next and looked at his brother with the expression of someone revising their understanding of the world. Eliza came in and immediately began a detailed inspection and announced that he was small but had good proportions. Henry came in asleep and had to be shown William the following morning, and spent a long time looking at him before offering his verdict, which was that William was nice. Redemption Creek was no paradise. The summer of 1884 brought drought that hit the ranchers hard and made tempers short and credit tight. A dispute between 2 cattle operations to the north spilled into the edges of Redemption Creek in the form of men, with grievances stopping in the saloon and the town having to navigate carefully. There was injustice in the territory that Caroline had seen clearly from her first days in it. The way the Mexican families on the south side of town were treated with a casual lesser regard by certain businesses and certain people. The way the Comanche who passed through were spoken of by some men with a contempt that turned Caroline's stomach. The way a single woman with children was immediately categorized by people who did not know her into their own convenient narratives. None of this was invisible to her. She had experienced her own version of it when she arrived, and she recognized it when she saw it happen to others. She and Dolores Gutierrez became genuine friends, and through Dolores she came to know more of the South Side families and their histories and their present difficulties. And she and Clara Watts between them managed several quiet interventions over the years that helped people when the town's official channels were too slow or too biased to do so themselves. Ira had his own version of this reckoning. He was a man with enough authority in himself not to need contempt for others, and he had been in enough places and done enough kinds of work to have a healthy skepticism of anyone who claimed superiority on the basis of birth or race. He and the Becker Ranch's best hand, a man named Louis Morales who had been born in Chihuahua and had been in Texas since he was 16, developed a friendship of the working kind that was built on respect and grew into something genuine. And Ira saw clearly what Lewis navigated in terms of the town's various attitudes, and it confirmed his own orientation toward fairness with the weight of evidence. None of these were battles they won entirely. The injustices of 1882 Texas were structural and deep, and not dissolved by the good intentions of a few individuals. But Caroline and Ira both lived their particular corner of it with the consistency of people who believed that how you treated a person in front of you was a choice you made every day. In the autumn of 1884, Thomas turned 9 and began accompanying Ira to the Becker ranch on Saturdays in an arrangement with the Beckers that was officially a learning opportunity and was practically a small wage, because the Beckers had 3 daughters and needed reliable young help. Thomas saved his earnings in a tin box under his bed with a discipline that reminded Caroline of someone saving toward a dream rather than for a specific thing. And when she asked him what he was saving for, he said, "A horse," with the certainty of someone who has already decided the matter and is merely accumulating the means. Eliza turned 7 and started school in the small schoolhouse that had been built on the east side of Main Street, where she horrified and impressed her teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Patterson, by turning in an essay on the history of Redemption Creek that was 3 pages long and based entirely on research she had conducted by interviewing the oldest residents of the town. Miss Patterson sent a note home saying that Eliza's intellectual initiative was remarkable and that she required, possibly, a larger challenge than the current curriculum offered. Henry turned 5 and became best friends with a boy named Miguel Gutierrez, Doyle's youngest, and together they constituted a small force of nature that operated on the principle that interesting things were where you found them, and finding them was worth any amount of trouble. William grew from new and solemn-faced to a baby of expansive personality. Enormous grins and determined attempts to stand before his legs were properly ready for it. An endearing stubbornness that Ira observed with an expression of someone seeing something familiar from an unexpected angle. "He looks exactly like you when he doesn't get what he wants," Caroline told Ira one evening, watching William push himself up and fall and push up again with an expression of absolute commitment. "I am going to disagree with that characterization," Ira said. "You can disagree all you like," she said. "He is you completely." He looked at her with the warm, dry amusement that she had come to love as much as everything else about him. "And what parts of you did he get?" "The good judgment," she said, "obviously." He laughed and she laughed, and William, pleased by the laughter, pulled himself upright against the table leg and stood, finally, and looked at them both with an expression of triumph so complete and pure that they both fell silent in the face of it. This small person at the absolute beginning of his standing life. By 1885, the house east of Redemption Creek had grown its 3rd room, a real bedroom for the older children separate from William's room, and the kitchen garden had expanded to a proper kitchen plot, and a small orchard of 4 young apple trees that Caroline tended, with a patience that Ira found beautiful, watering and pruning, and talking to them occasionally in a way she would deny if asked. He would sometimes come home in the late afternoon and find her in the orchard with her sleeves rolled and her hands in the earth, and he would stand at the fence for a moment just watching, the way he had watched her in the early days, because she was still someone worth stopping to look at, more so now than then, because now he knew everything that was underneath the straight-backed composure, all the grief and courage and stubbornness and warmth. And knowing it made seeing her across a garden feel like something enormous and simple at once. She always seemed to know when he was watching. She would not turn immediately, but a slight change would come into the set of her shoulders, something relaxing, and then she would look up, and across the distance between them, her face would change in the particular way it changed for him. Not a smile exactly, or not only a smile, but an opening of some quality in it that she did not show the general world. He would come through the gate and she would say something practical about the trees or the day's events, and he would say something back, and they would walk together to the house through the evening air, and it was always, every time, enough. One evening in the fall of 1885, sitting outside after the children were in bed, with the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky over the panhandle, vast and indifferent and beautiful, Ira said, "I want you to know something." She was beside him on the bench he had built against the south wall, the wood still warm from the day's sun. "What?" she said. "That day in October," he said, "when I walked into the church and saw you there." She waited. "I didn't know at the time what I was doing or what it meant. I just knew I could not walk past you. I cannot give you a more complicated explanation than that." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the appearing stars. "I know," she said. "I think sometimes the things that matter most are the simple ones, not simple to live, but simple in what they are." He took her hand. She held it. "Caroline," he said, "I want you to know that every day of the last 3 years has been the best use of my time I have ever made." She turned her head to look at him. The first stars were clear now, and in the last of the daylight his face was as familiar to her as her own hands, this face that had been a stranger's 3 years ago and was now as necessary to her daily life as the sun or the ground under her feet. "I love you," she said. "I will never stop saying it because it seems important to say." "I love you," he said, "with the entirety of whatever I am made of." They sat in the warmth that lingered in the wood, and the early stars multiplied above them, and the house behind them held their 4 children, sleeping and dreaming and growing toward their own futures, and the 12 acres around them were dark and quiet, and the creek was running a mile to the west, and the town of Redemption Creek sat on the flat land under the great sky of 1885 Texas, small and impermanent and full of living, and Caroline Doyle Hunter felt, in a way that was complete and had no edges, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. In the spring of 1886, there were 5 apple blossoms on the trees that Caroline had planted 3 years before, the first true flowering of the orchard, and she stood among them on a May morning with William on her hip and her hand on one of the low branches, and she felt that particular completion of patient things that is its own kind of happiness. Ira came out across the kitchen garden and stood looking at the blossoms and at her, and she could see from his expression that he was thinking the same thing. "3 more years and we'll have apples," she said. "I can wait," he said. "You've gotten very good at that," she said. "I had a good reason to learn," he said. She smiled at him across the branch. William grabbed at the blossom closest to his reach, and she redirected his hand gently to the branch itself, and he curled his fingers around it with solemn attention. 3 more years," she said again, and it was not only about the apples. Thomas was now 11 and had saved enough for a horse, a young roan he named Copperhead for the color of him, and he rode that horse with an ease that Domingo Becker said was one of the finest natural seats he had seen in years. Thomas rode in the mornings before school with a seriousness and joy combined that was good to see in a boy who had carried so much gravity since he was 7. Eliza at 9 was writing a history. She had informed the family at dinner one evening that she was writing the history of Redemption Creek, beginning from the founding, and that she would need to interview everyone who had been here since the early days. She conducted these interviews in her school journal with additional pages she sewed in herself, and the resulting document was already 40 pages long and was being read in installments by Miss Patterson, who had written to the County Board of Education in a letter that Eliza did not know about, recommending that this particular student receive special educational opportunities when such existed. Henry at 6 was learning to read and was deeply annoyed by the slowness of the process. He approached reading the way he approached everything, with a frontal assault, wanting to be able to do it immediately and completely, and being frustrated by the reality that it took time. Caroline sat with him every evening for 30 minutes at the table, patient and steady, and by spring, He could read simple sentences with a satisfaction that replaced the frustration in his face incrementally, like daylight replacing dark. William was too, and a full person, opinionated and curious and deeply attached to the family dog, a cattle-dog mix named Biscuit that had arrived at the house as a stray the previous autumn and had declined all attempts at relocation with a stubbornness that was eventually recognized as the dog's superior judgment about where it belonged. The household ran. It was not simple, and it was not without difficulty. The money was sometimes tight, and the weather was sometimes brutal, and there were weeks when everything seemed to press at once. But it ran on the combination of two capable people who trusted each other completely and communicated honestly about everything, and who had both learned, by different roads and at significant cost, that what they had was not to be squandered or taken for granted for a single day. On the evening of their third wedding anniversary, the 15th of March, 1886, Ira took Caroline out in the buckboard under the spring sky to the spot on the east edge of their land, where the view opened widest across the flat Texas country. And he had put a blanket in the bed of the buckboard and brought coffee in the tin pot and 2 cups, and they sat in the bed of the wagon looking east while the stars came out and drank their coffee and talked about everything and nothing. The children and the land and the store accounts and the Becker cattle operation and the book Ira was reading and the letter she had gotten from Clara's cousin in New Mexico, all the ordinary contents of their days, which were also everything. At some point the talking stopped and they simply looked at the stars side by side, and he had his arm around her and she had her head against his shoulder, and the March air was cold and clear and smelled of new grass and distant rain, and the stars above the panhandle were as many as they had ever been, indifferent and permanent and extraordinary. "Do you remember," she said, "what I said to you that first morning, after the blankets?" "You said thank you," he said. "I said far more than that was in it," she said. "I know," he said. "I heard it. I think I have been saying thank you to you ever since," she said, "in every possible form." He was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening slightly around her. "And I have been saying the same to you," he said. "For 3 years, for a home, for your children, who I love as fully as if they had always been mine, for William, for the daily particular dignity of your company, which is something I did not know I needed and now cannot conceive of being without." She turned her face up toward him in the dark, and he bent his head toward her, and they kissed under the March stars above their 12 acres, and their house with the new rooms and the young apple orchard and their children sleeping inside. And it was the kiss of two people who know exactly what they have, who came to it by hard roads and chose it with clear eyes, and who intend to keep it with the full commitment of people who understand what its absence would mean. The years would continue to accumulate. There would be more difficulty and more beauty, more tight winters and abundant springs, more of the ordinary complicated work of a life built on a hard landscape. Thomas would grow to a rancher's height and take a job with the Becker operation proper at 15. A grown young man who still had his father's eyes and his mother's jaw and Ira's habit of watching carefully before speaking. Eliza would go to the teacher's college in Austin at 17, leaving on a stagecoach very different from the one that had abandoned her mother at a turnoff in 1882, and she would come back to teach school in Redemption Creek and eventually write the county history that she had begun at 9. Which would be published in 1899 and dedicated to her mother. Henry would become a doctor, which surprised everyone and surprised no one, his need to fix things finding its proper form at last, leaving Redemption Creek at 18 for medical study in Dallas and coming back years later to be the town's doctor, where he would spend his life. William, steady and curious and his father's quiet character in full, would take the 12 acres and make them 30 and eventually 60, and he would work the land with the same careful attention that Ira had brought to everything he did, and he would carry in his blood the combined stubbornness of both his parents, which would serve him very well. Caroline would live to see all of this. She would live past the turn of the century with Ira beside her, both of them gray and steady and still, on the evenings of long days, sitting together outside the house with their coffee, while the Texas sky performed its daily enormity above them. She would hold grandchildren and tell them about the morning she walked 3 miles into a town she had never seen with nothing but her children and her pride and a cracked leather satchel. She would tell them about the blankets. She would tell them that sometimes the beginning of everything looks like exactly nothing: a strange town, a church pew, a borrowed blanket. That you cannot always see the shape of the thing while you are still in the middle of it. That the man who covered you in your most exposed moment without asking anything in return, who sat in the back pew of the church to make sure you were all right when you woke, who learned a child's card game with complete and genuine attention, who kissed you for the first time outside a town hall while the fiddle played inside, who wrote in a book of poems that you deserved more beautiful things than the world had been giving you. That man might be the thing the road was always pointed toward, even when the road felt like it was going nowhere. She would say that she believed in a particular kind of grace that was not always supernatural, but was sometimes just very human. The grace of someone paying attention to a person who needed to be seen. The grace of a blanket spread over sleeping children in a cold church before morning. The grace of a person who decides, quietly and without announcement, that something is worth showing up for. And Ira Hunter, sitting beside her in the evenings of their long years together, would sometimes catch the end of these tellings and would look at his wife with the same dark eyes that had watched her across a church pew in October 1882, still carrying the same warmth, the same attention, the same quality of presence that had been the first thing she recognized in him and the last thing she would ever forget. The turquoise ring stayed on her finger every day of her life. The stone Eliza had given him stayed in his vest pocket until the vest wore out, and then he kept it on the shelf by the window where he could see it from his chair. The apple trees bore fruit every year from 1889 onward, and Caroline's orchard grew to 12 trees, and in a good season they made more applesauce and dried apple rings than the family could eat and gave the rest away to anyone who needed it, which was also a kind of answer to the question of what grace looks like when it grows into itself over time. It looks like a family at a table in the lamplight. It looks like a man coming home through a kitchen garden at the end of a day. It looks like a woman looking up from apple trees and feeling in her chest the particular completeness of a life that was rebuilt from rubble into something that was, in its way, more fully itself than the first version ever had the chance to be. It looks like love, patient and particular and real, in a small house on 12 acres on the edge of the Texas panhandle, in the last years of the old wild century, the grass running away to the horizon in every direction and the sky above it going on forever, and two people inside it knowing, without any reservation, that they are exactly where they belong.